My name is Arnold Weinfeld. I'm Associate Director at the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research at Michigan State University. And welcome to another of our monthly Policy Forum Lunch and Learns. Very pleased to see you here today. I'm very pleased to have with us folks from both the Citizens Research Council for Michigan and Michigan State University to talk to you about not just the Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference, but also some research work that's being done on how people across the state of Michigan feel about the economy in general. So with that, I'll do some introductions. From the Citizens Research Council, we have Bob Schneider. Bob is in his second stint with the Research Council, having first worked for the organization from 2013 to 2015. He spent most of his time in state government. He's worked for the Office of Health and Human Services, the State Budget Office, and was Associate Director for the nonpartisan Michigan House Fiscal Agency. He has extensive expertise and has provided nonpartisan advice and analysis on state policy and budget matters in areas including corrections, human services, and transportation. From Michigan State University, we have Mark Skidmore. Dr. Skidmore serves as Professor and Morris Chair in State and Local Government Finance at Michigan State Universities. He has joint appointments in the Department of Agriculture, Food and Resource Economics, and the Department of Economics, and is a distinguished scholar at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Professor Skidmore conducts research on public sector economics, regional economics, health, and the economics of disasters. And with him is Yi-Rim Lee. Yi-Rim is a PhD student in agriculture, food, and resource economics at Michigan State. Her research explores inflation dynamics, energy economics, and regional economic disparities, focusing on the differing impacts of price changes on rural and urban communities. So first, we will have Bob discuss the results of the Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference, and today the governor is currently, I think, announcing her budget? Tomorrow, thank you. So this is good information as that comes out. Bob?
Thank you so much, Arnold. How am I doing with voice carrying through the room? Everybody can hear me well? Awesome. Well, thank you again for coming. I'm happy to be here today. I always enjoy coming to the IPPSR forums. We get a good crowd, a lot of legislative staff, sometimes legislators, folks from all the interest groups in the area. It's a good group to speak before. So thank you to Arnold for having me back, and thank you all for coming today. We're going to talk a little bit about tomorrow, the budget release, and what we can expect. We heard recently about good news on the revenue front. Revenues were revised upward in January at the Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference. So that's good news, but what's it really mean for tomorrow? How much room is there to grow the budget, if that's what the governor wants to do? How much room is there for tax relief, if that's what the governor or other lawmakers eventually want to do? What's the status of the budget going forward right now? So just a quick commercial for my organization, the Citizens Research Council. We are now 106 years old as an organization. That surprises some people. They know we've been around a long time, but maybe not that long. Our role, we see our role as helping make good public policy. And our research is designed to help inform the public, help inform policymakers. How can we improve our efforts at sound public policy? We do rely on charitable donations. We're fortunate to have a lot of good foundation support and some business support. But if you have any room in your charitable giving, please look us up, crcmich.org, and consider a gift if our work has value in what you do. So let's get behind the numbers from the Consensus Conference from a couple weeks back. And so we'll look at what were the numbers, what were the revenue revisions, what drove those revenue revisions, and I'll try to make a case for the poor forecasters who are trying to do this as to why they're kind of in a little unique situation that's making things extra hard. So we'll talk about why we've seen some errors in the forecast recently in particular. Then we're going to talk about what does it mean for tomorrow? How much room is there to grow the budget? How much room for growth or tax relief is there currently? So the state has two big major revenue funds, the general fund and the school aid fund. And when we talk about the dollar decisions in the budget, almost all of those decisions are about how do we allocate these scarce resources within the state budget. This is the general fund, general purpose revenue. The blue line on this chart is the forecast from last May. The orange line above it is the more recent estimates from just in January. And you see the good news here. We have about $500 million roughly each year in additional revenue than we thought we had back last May. And note one thing, all of these adjustments really have to do with fiscal year 24, the fiscal year that just ended. All this new revenue is really about recalibrating our starting point in this fiscal year that just concluded. We have $550 million more dollars. That's 5% higher than we thought we were going to have at the end of the year that just concluded in May. Otherwise, the slope of the line looks pretty similar for the general fund. The longer term growth rates haven't changed much at all. The same is true for our school aid fund. And our school aid fund is mostly K-12 schools, a little bit to community colleges and universities, but education, the education component of the state budget. And again, it's mostly about 24. We have about $300 million in additional revenue forecast for fiscal year 24, the year that just concluded, and that carries forward. We maintain that. It's not temporary, wasn't a one-time blip. We stay on that same trend growth rate in those out years. School aid fund was a little smaller, a little less than 2%, but that's still a significant revenue bump. And if you add it up, then we have about $850 million in new revenue on an annual basis than we were anticipating about 7-8 months ago. So what drove it? Why do we have such a big change in fiscal year 24 in the revenue revisions? And I would say not all of it, but the great majority of it comes from the income tax. And what this chart shows you is, along with the revenue projections, there are economic projections at these consensus revenue conferences. And the blue bars are the forecast for Michigan personal income and real personal income for 2024 from May. And then they were orange on my chart. They look kind of pink from this vantage point. The pink bars are the new estimate from January. They didn't change a lot, but going from $620 billion in personal income to $644 billion, that's $24 billion in extra realized personal income. And largely it's this income, this sort of, wow, the economy was a little better, people's earnings were better than we were forecasting. That was big enough to jump up those income, both the nominal and inflation adjusted income, by 3 to 4%. And that's what's driving basically that revision in the revenue, that the economy and earnings in particular in 24 were stronger than the economists saw back earlier in May. I know almost all of the economists who are involved in the forecasting process. They're smart people. They work very hard at their forecasts. They've won awards for some of their forecasts. We seem to be having a lot of errors. Let me try to make a apologist view or something for what's going on. What would you like to? What you're seeing here is a chart with what I would say the income and the sales tax are the two the dominant taxes in Michigan in terms of revenue raising. And we also have a corporate income tax. And if you asked me to name number 3, I'd probably put that as number 3. Income and sales are the dominant two. This chart measures the growth in those 3 taxes from 2015 to the present. So the blue line is income tax, orange line is sales tax, the green line is the corporate income tax. And just to explain this chart, it all starts at 1. This is a growth index. So once the lines go to 1.2, that means it's grown by 20% from fiscal year 15. Once they go to 1.4, that means they've grown 40% from fiscal year 2015, the base year. Look what happened for the first 5 years. Well, that's what forecasters want. Nice straight lines, corporate income tax jumping around because it's very volatile, but it's still following a fairly straight trend. What happened in 2020? COVID hits, and now everything kind of goes off the rails. Notice our corporate income tax in 2020 was about $1.1 billion. It's doubled in dollar. We're getting $2.2 billion from the corporate income tax. Corporate earnings have been very strong, and we've benefited from that. But even the sales and income tax have both jumped up. We've had this sort of unpredictable jump in revenue that we kept experiencing during COVID. Inflation's part of that. When things cost more and I pay a sales tax on more expensive items, we raise more revenue. So inflation's part of it. But for income tax, we had a whole bunch of COVID-related stimulus, 3 rounds of tax rebates. We had the Paycheck Protection Program, enhanced unemployment benefits. We've also now cut the income tax pretty significantly. So lots of things happening there. The sales tax, I just make one point with the sales tax. There has been a shift that happened with COVID where consumer purchases are shifting more towards stuff, goods, taxable goods, and away from services, which we don't impose a sales tax on. And we're not quite, COVID certainly was the start gun for that. We're not sure when it's going to come back, but that helps explain some of the uncertainties and volatility in the revenues that we've seen. This is the same chart, only it's adjusted for inflation. So here is nominal actual dollars, I should say nominal actual growth. Here is inflation adjusted growth. And here, I guess if there's any good news for the forecasters, sales and income tax have both kind of come back towards what that inflation adjusted trend looked like. But remember, we've cut income taxes significantly, treatment of retirement income, earned income tax credit. We had the one-time cut in the rate. So really, you'd expect us to be below the trend now, and we're not. We're back to trend. But corporate income tax still well above the trend. And for forecasters, we're trying to decide, all right, so how much are we already where we need to be and we're going to grow normally, and how much pulling back towards this trend do we have? And I think that has a lot to do with the nature of some of the forecast errors we've seen recently. So revenues are up. There's still a lot of uncertainty related to whether, when and if we come back to sort of these long-term trends. I did want to talk about one other economic matter, which is uncertainty. I think there's more uncertainty now in the revenue projections as well, with some of the changes coming in federal policy. And I stole this slide right from the University of Michigan's research seminar in quantitative economics, who present at the revenue conference. These were their assumptions that they built into their economic projections that then help drive the revenue projections. And I would just point to, particularly, let's look at the tariffs one. Tariffs, they assume tariffs on imports from China will jump, but not until 2026. They'll eventually triple, but it would be delayed. So we know it's modest, but immediate. It didn't get delayed. So we have tariffs on China now. And then no significant or lasting new tariffs on the rest of the world. Well, last week I would have said, whoops, that's going to be wrong. But now maybe it's not, right? We've sort of reached at least a tentative pause in those, and we'll see what happens. That will be a major factor. The deportation, immigration stuff will be a major factor. I think the stuff towards the top probably is going to happen, so they probably got that right. But a lot of things happening right now that could cause the economic forecast to deviate from what they were, from the forecast that they came to in January, and then that could have ripple effects on those revenue estimates. So, now what does all this mean for tomorrow? The governor is going to release her budget at noon tomorrow. The state budget director is going to do the presentation. Where are we at for tomorrow? How much room do we have to grow the budget, to shift money around? As we've talked about the Speaker Hall's road proposal that wants to redirect money within the budget. So how much room do we have before we get into any budget cutting to do that as well? What do those forecasts mean? Just a quick sip of water here before I start to get too dry mouthed. So what is this chart telling us? The orange line there is our January, most recent January, general fund revenue forecast. That's what we just saw, only I've taken May out now, and this is just the January forecast. That red dotted line is what I would call the baseline budget. How much do we need to just continue what we already passed in fiscal year 25? That budget's done. We know what ongoing appropriations are from the general fund. We built the Senate Fiscal Agency. I borrowed from their analysis. They looked at other cost pressures. State payroll costs are going to go up a bit because the state employees are due a pay raise. The Health and Human Services budget always has deviations with caseload programs like Medicaid and other social service programs, so we build in some inflationary adjustments for those. But we need about just over $15 billion just to keep things, no increases, no cuts to programs that change, programs. That's how much we need to just keep things the way they were last year. So how does revenue compare to that? We have a budget surplus. On the general fund side, it should be in the $400 to $450 million range. That's probably close to 3%. And I would call that kind of normal. 2 years ago, we had a $2 billion surplus in ongoing, and not just one-time revenue. Permanent revenue was above permanent spending by about $2 billion. We've now spent or given some of that money back. We have room for probably $450 million in general fund growth, or $450 million in general fund to give back to taxpayers, or $450 million in general fund to transfer to something else like roads or whatever it might be that's not general fund finance. And you have room to do that before any budget cutting. You can do a lot more of all of that, but then you need to cut the budget, which you can absolutely do. But this is what our kind of permanent revenue minus permanent spending surplus is coming in. And so the governor should have room, if she wishes, to bump up that general fund budget by about 3%. Important to note that all of that growth is really responsible to us for a set of expiring earmarks from the corporate income tax that is set, it's in law, is coming due now in fiscal year 23, 24, and 25, when we had a lot of, when we saw the corporate income tax really jump. Lawmakers said, we're going to make some temporary earmarks from that corporate income tax. We're going to give $500 million for those 3 years to the SOAR fund, Strategic Opportunity and Attraction Reserve Fund. I think if I'm remembering the acronym right. Our Business Attraction Fund. Here's $400 million to build a plant here, a battery plant or something. And then another $50 million for placemaking grants. How can we make our communities more attractive so that we attract talent and attract business to Michigan? Both of those earmarks expire. All $550 million of that dumps back into the general fund in fiscal year 26, and that's why we have growth. If those hadn't expired, we would really have, the dotted line would be where we would be at. And we would actually be entering this budget with a slight budget hole, a very manageable one. But we basically be in we got to cut a little bit, and then any growth has to come from somewhere else in the budget. We don't have room for anything. And that's important to note, and I don't think folks have fully appreciated that in looking at the good news from a couple weeks ago. So general fund up $450 million, but all due to those expiring earmarks. Otherwise, we would have been looking at a very flat revenue growth. Different story for the school aid fund. School aid fund revenues continue to grow. Did the same thing. That red dotted line is based on some Senate Fiscal Agency analysis. It suggests, maintaining our current appropriations means we need about $17.9 billion in school aid fund dollars. We have about $1 billion more. That's almost 5.5–6% growth in the school aid fund. So on the school aid fund side, if you're K-12 schools, and maybe if you pray hard and you're the universities or the community colleges who also share in some school aid fund, that's room for some significant growth on that side of the budget. It'll be interesting to see tomorrow how that surplus is tapped and whether any of it is reserved. And how much we put, for instance, into our rainy day fund, which is already in pretty good shape, but good idea to continue to invest in that. So that's where we're at. A pretty healthy school aid fund, normal, regular growth in the general fund. What to watch for tomorrow, how much of that gets spent, how much gets appropriated. Does the governor hold anything back? I think the governor has sort of signaled there's not going to be a lot about the roads in this budget, but in a couple of weeks there'll be a follow-up presentation where she may put some parameters on her own road funding plan. Again, that House Republican proposal would lean heavily on redirecting existing general fund. So our own analysis suggests we've got about $450 million in free, easy revenue, but the rest of the $2–2.5 billion that you need for that pure, we're redirecting existing revenue plan that Speaker Hall proposed is probably about $2 billion. Can you cut $2 billion from the general fund budget? You sure can. You sure can, but it's cutting into 75% of that general fund is Medicaid and social services, universities, and corrections. So $2 billion is a lot. You really need to cut into those areas with some significance to get there, because there's just not a lot left after that. So we'll see what happens tomorrow. And I will be interested. The first thing I'm going to look at is, all right, how much, if any, of those surpluses have been left on the table, and maybe the governor would signal then we want to hold some money back so that we have sort of a tax revenue but budget cuts mixed plan, or does it all get spent, which to me would be a signal that we're going to do something different with roads once we put our plan together that may rely more on raising new revenue. So. That is it. I hope that was helpful. And Arnold, if there's time, I'm happy to take questions.
Sure. Maybe we'll wait until the next presentation and then we'll do the question. So, once again, Michigan has a budget surplus. I appreciate the fact that Bob has pointed out that that's mainly due to these expiring incentives.
Earmarks.
Earmarks. Thank you. Earmarks for economic development and placemaking purposes, so that's important to keep in mind. But this is third or fourth year in a row we've had a budget surplus now, and
It's getting a little smaller, but
we continue to have budget surpluses. On the other side of the coin, we also know that inflation has been an issue the last couple of years. So even though Michigan continues to have a budget surplus, inflation certainly has eaten into spending priorities of people across the state. And to talk about some of that research, I'm going to introduce Mark Skidmore to describe some of that. Thanks, Mark.
Good afternoon, everyone. Really great to be here as well. So thanks for the great presentation. Oh, that's a good question.
I think he's got it.
Good. All right, thanks to you, Rim. So this is what we're going to present today as a part of a broader research project, thinking about prices in general and how prices rise geographically. The Consumer Price Index, the CPI, measures a certain bundle, it's thought of as sort of the average bundle of goods and the cost of those for a typical household in an urban area. But we don't know a lot about what happens to prices in rural places, and oftentimes we assume that changes in prices in rural places match the urban places, which may or may not be true. So that's part of it. In addition to that, we were also interested in the perceptions of price changes. And so thanks to a grant from IPPSR, we were able to include some questions to Michiganders about their perceptions of prices. So I'm going to introduce Yirim in just a moment, but so I'm studying price changes, and the most common measure of price changes perhaps is the Consumer Price Index, and I just said it's based on a bundle of goods, and every time I have to remind myself, well, what's in that bundle? How many of you are really familiar with what's in that bundle? None of us, right? Even I don't know. It takes a while to figure that out. So how many of us, not knowing what's in that bundle, actually spend the precise amounts of their income to all of those specific goods? Only the average household, and none of us is average, right? And in addition to that, you think, well, wage increases. Well, wages should sort of compensate, any increase in wage should hopefully make up for the price increases. Do all of us have the same wage increase every year? There's quite a bit of variability. So our perceptions are based on our experiences, what we're buying, and how much money we earn, or how much money our income goes up. In addition to that, we all have our own biases and influences. And so there's the reality of inflation, which we try to track, and maybe we do a pretty good job at it with the CPI, but there are limitations to that as well. It's not a perfect measure, but probably more important even is our perception of it. And so we're very thankful to have an opportunity to share this work with you, and we're grateful to IPPSR for the grant that enabled us to explore how Michiganders are perceiving inflation. And so the team members looking at this broader project are Professor Scott Loveridge, Professor Dusan Paredes, Yirim Lee, and Fernanda Alfaro, who's also a graduate student. And Yirim has done some really great work pulling together these data and the analysis that you'll see as a graduate student. She's also doing really great work pulling data nationwide, looking at price changes in the gasoline market and other arenas. So with that, I want to hand it over to Yirim. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon. My name is Yirim Lee again, and I'm happy to be here today. And today I'm going to share with you some insights on our study on how Michiganders perceive inflation and how it has shaped their financial decisions over the past 5 years. So inflation has been one of the most talked about economic issues in recent years. From rising grocery bills to higher fuel costs, nearly everyone has felt its impact in some way. And personally, I knew inflation was serious when my morning coffee started to cost more than my regular entire breakfast used to. So now I'm brewing my own coffee and just go out here like that. But what people feel about inflation doesn't always align with the actual numbers. So public perceptions play a very important role in consumer behavior, policy expectations, and even economic stability. So through this study, we hope to provide a clearer understanding of inflation's impact on Michigan residents and offer insights that can help policymakers like you guys and community leaders make more informed decisions. So for today, I'm gonna go with the brief overview of our project and the survey, and we're gonna focus on 3 main survey results versus Michiganders' inflation perception, divided by each item category and their demographics. And then we move on to the behavioral changes because of the inflation. And we'll see how the value of money changes now versus 5 years later. So our project examines how Michigan residents perceive inflation and how they adjust their behaviors in response to rising prices over the past 5 years. So we focused on essential goods, especially like food and fuel prices, to compare inflation perception with actual price changes and identify socioeconomic factors influencing these perceptions. And we use Michigan State University IPPSR State of the State Survey, which is a very great survey. They conducted with 1,174 Michigan residents from September 23rd to October 10th last year, which is before the presidential election. And the final data set has 1,000 respondents that has been balanced by gender, age, race, and education. So by using a very representative sample, we ensure that our findings reflect a very broad cross-section of Michigan residents rather than just a particular demographic or region. And inflation experiences can differ between urban and rural residents depending on factors like transportation costs, wages, and accessibility to goods. So this map right over here shows the urban-rural classification of our respondents by zip code. So here you can see that the blue regions are metropolitan to brown region is rural. And we assume that the rural respondents may feel the impact of price changes more in certain items than urban residents. So understanding these differences is crucial for targeted policy interventions. So to start off with, our key research question is, how do Michiganders perceive inflation, and does it match actual price changes? So respondents were firstly asked whether prices today are lower, the same, a little higher, or a lot higher compared to 5 years ago. And here we firstly compare perceived inflation with reported data from Consumer Price Index, CPI, and the web scrape gas prices. So here in the yellow box, 69% of respondents believe that prices are overall a lot higher than 5 years ago. And for grocery prices are 75%. And if you look at the measured inflation of Michigan, which is calculated using the BLS data, and a little disclaimer here, this is a data for Detroit or in Dearborn area, so there might be some differences there. It seems like CPI and Michigan gas prices data show that inflation has increased, but not as drastically as many perceive. So 24% increase, and the wage, 25%, looks very similar. But however, it is important to note that the Consumer Price Index is widely used measure of inflation, but it doesn't always reflect the true cost of living due to factors like quality adjustments or shrinkflation. And also the increase in wage might vary by income group or regions. Me personally, I didn't feel my wage has been increased 25% for 5 years.
Sorry about that.
Thank you. And so we're gonna look at, following slides are gonna be about how inflation perception is different by each demographic groups. So here you see how people perceive inflation for overall prices, and you can see that more than 50% of people in all of the groups felt that prices are a lot higher than 5 years ago. And you can see some distinct patterns here for each category. I'm not sure you can actually read that. Yeah. Kind of small, sorry about that. So first column in the first row is urban-rural classification. So you can see that people living in rural areas tend to perceive higher inflation than those in urban areas. And the second row is by gender. And female respondents were more likely than males to perceive prices are a lot higher. And the third row is political affiliation. The difference is quite striking for red and blue box right there. So 87% of Republicans, the red box, reported that inflation was high compared to only 52% of Democrats. And this highlights how inflation perception isn't just shaped by personal experience, but also like broader political and economic narratives. And for household income in the second column, the first row, you can see that respondents closer to the median income perceive higher inflation. And when we look at age, the second row in the second column, there's a clear trend that the older the respondent, the higher their inflation perception is. And for the price of groceries, the patterns are largely similar, and the gaps between each group are narrower, except for the gender. The women tend to be primary grocery shoppers in many households, so we assume their frequent exposure to price changes at the store makes inflation more noticeable and impactful in their daily lives. And for the restaurant prices, they are also largely the same, but if you see the urban-rural classification, you can see that the gap between rural and urban respondents has narrowed. For gas prices, we can see that the fewer than half of respondents reported high inflation, indicating the fuel increases may not be strongly felt as other categories I showed you before. However, some patterns stand out, like rural residents still perceive higher inflation compared to the urban residents, probably likely due to greater reliance on personal vehicles. And also the political affiliation also plays a big role here, with 78% of Republicans saying gas prices are much higher. And also more than half of the lower income group and the oldest age group reported high inflation compared to the others, reflecting greater sensitivity to fuel costs and daily expenses in that group. And for last, for housing costs, you can see there's a similar pattern, but a shorter only half of respondents said prices are a lot higher compared to the other item categories. But here the rural group also stands out, that rural respondents, 67% of them responded that costs for your home are a lot higher than 5 years ago. And for the next question, we asked the behavioral change. So respondents were asked, are you doing things differently because of the price increases? And in fact, 78% of respondents changed behavior due to this price increase. And of these 78%, more than 80% ate out less or choose cheaper restaurants, and about 73% adjusted grocery store purchases, and around 50% reduced entertainment spending like streaming services, or delayed vacations and major purchases for cars. So you can see that this shift highlights how inflation doesn't just influence the perception, it actively reshapes financial priorities and lifestyle choices. And for last, we also explored how inflation affects financial decision-making. So respondents were asked, a long-lost relative dies and unexpectedly leaves you a sum of money. You may either take $20,000 right away or take $32,000 5 years from now. And that's 10% interest per year. And what is very surprising is that in 2024 survey, 58% preferred immediate cash. That means they're worried that inflation will reduce its value over time. And 26% more likely to wait for the higher payout, showing there's a difference in risk tolerance and financial planning. We actually asked the same question in 2006, where federal funds rate were similar as in 2024. And you can see that now around 10% of people have no preference or even never get the money. So we're assuming that some people may struggle to choose due to economic uncertainty, lack of financial confidence, or distrust in some institutions, while others may simply don't need this money. So this overall suggests that inflation influences short-term financial behaviors, potentially reducing long-term wealth accumulations. There are some differences between people who said prices are higher compared to 5 years ago, and people who responded that prices are same or lower than 5 years ago. So more people responded that they're gonna get money right now and for later, and you can see that respondents who said the prices are same or lower don't need the money, or they'll never get the money from their long lost relative. So overall, people tend to perceive inflation as higher than actual rates, with differences across demographic groups. And this perception is not just a number, it's actively shaping consumers' behavior, leading to reduced spending on restaurants, retails, and even travel. So it's also influencing financial decisions, from delaying major purchases for cars to reconsidering these saving strategies. So these insights highlight the importance of effective inflation communication with the residents, well-designed economic policies, and consumer protection efforts to address public concerns. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
As you can see, despite the fact that the state of Michigan continues to have budget surpluses, certainly at the grassroots level, folks are concerned and holding back. And quite likely the discussion going on about tariffs is also going to hold back some purchases. We do have time for questions of Bob or Mark and Yerim. Tony has the mic back there, and first question.
I just have a comment about, in real terms, what's happening. So in Oak Park, my sister lives. Her two neighbors on either side are retired, and they're requiring to go to the food bank. And they're in their 70s, both of them.
Any other questions, thoughts?
Renata?
Oh,
Yeah, I just had a thought, so.
wait for the mic.
Oh, fine, with my.
So some of the, when you talk about what the perception of inflation is versus what it actually is, I feel like the perception is one thing, but I think a lot of people don't care. They're gonna say, I don't give a rat's ass what the perception is. This is what my wallet is telling me. And so how do you combat that when you try to educate people about, the perception versus the reality of it? Because I think people's reality is maybe not the same as what the economic reality is.
I think that's a good question, because we all have different perceptions, and some of those perceptions are based on our actual experience. If your wage is flat and you're faced with higher prices, you're going to have to make some adjustments. And so some people's wages are flat, some people's wages are growing, so maybe they don't feel it as much. So each family has to decide how to adjust all of this, but I think the bottom line is, from the survey anyway, that the CPI is just one measure of inflation, and it's not perfect. It doesn't capture all of the experiences that people are having, and may even underestimate true inflation to some degree. So we can't say for sure how much of those perceptions are their real experiences versus they're just their perception. But certainly I think the data are showing that we all are at least perceiving there's this pressure And we have, I mean, this morning, on Tuesdays, about every other Tuesday, I go out for breakfast. And I had an omelet and a couple pieces of bacon. And it, you know, the bill was gonna be like $14 or $15 before the tip. And then I thought, I'm gonna skip the coffee because that's another $3. Now I'm looking at $20 for breakfast. And I'm like, so I altered my decision, right? I didn't buy the coffee. And I think we're all sort of, you know, maybe making those kinds of little adjustments. And so our quality of life may still be, you know, like I'm happy that I was able to go have breakfast, but I just skipped the coffee. I don't know, maybe we're doing that.
Well, and, you know, throughout my career, I'm not an economist, but throughout my career, I've loved to play one almost every day. And like Mark said, we only have one set of figures here. And even though we know that the unemployment rate has been in pretty good shape here the last several years, we have to take a look at the wages of the jobs being created. And I think when we would look at the wages of the jobs being created, they're less than what might be needed for a married couple or a family of four to really put money away and spend $20 for one breakfast. What happened to the $5.99 eggs and bacon special? I don't know. So that's another figure that I think we have to keep in mind too, is that even though jobs are being created, what are the wages of those jobs and how does that play? Johannes?
You're the wait first.
Yeah, thank you, Johannes Bauer. Thank you for this presentation and really interesting insights. As I was hoping, given how Mark started the introduction, that the average only tells us so much, I was hoping that you would show us a little bit more of the distribution of numbers among these different categories. And I'm wondering whether you could do this from your analysis. But I had actually two other questions quickly. One was, can you tell anything of how people form these perceptions, right? Because it makes a big difference whether I form my perception by listening to a podcast host on my way home, or whether I look at the statistical information, or whether it's my experience in a restaurant. And then, you know, that sort of ties to the question from before, because depending on how I form my perception, the response might be different, right? I mean, so we have to know a little bit more about how people form those perceptions.
Absolutely right. I think after we saw the results, we all sort of wished we would have asked people, you know, where their main news sources are from, you know, those kinds of things, because our perceptions are formed from our experiences, but also we have our own biases as well as our media sources. So we're contemplating doing another survey next year and similar questions, but asking those kinds of questions as well.
So we can expect another MAPR grant application. In the room?
Hi, I was really fascinated by your demographic data, but I really want to talk about the geographical data. So why is it you think that metropolitan areas felt less of an impact with inflation than rural areas? Was there anything that you perceived maybe that prices increased more for them, or that maybe that metropolitan areas are used to these price increases? Just from my own perspective, living in Grand Rapids, I did not actually see an increase in rent, but rent spiked actually 5 years ago. And then it kind of stayed the same. So maybe that is something you perceive, or maybe it spiked in rural communities during COVID. I'm just really fascinated by what the perception there was.
I guess you can go if you'd like.
Okay, so we've been studying about like these rural and urban differences and studying like why do they have these changes, why do they have these gaps between rural areas and urban areas. We are still studying on that, but one assumption is that probably for restaurant prices, in rural areas, there aren't a lot of McDonald's or Subway compared to like the urban areas like in Detroit. So maybe the competition is different, and that's why the price changes are not following as in the rural area. And should I add?
So there may be real differences. Another factor might be that during COVID, some people actually left urban areas to rural places, so that might be a factor in demand, sort of a demand-driven issue. We don't know that, but that's an idea. And the other thing is that rural populations tend to be older, and we saw from the demographics that older, when you have more experience, you say, holy cow, maybe the context is important. So it could be that some of the differences that we see between urban and rural have to do with sort of the demographic makeup of rural places relative to urban as well. And we plan to explore that more carefully. Thank you.
I think I have a question here.
I noticed this perception business versus reality, and I want to ask Bob. I didn't get a chance to listen to the program the other day presented to legislators. Are they aware of this perceptual difference between reality of real cost increases versus the perception of the public? Was that covered at all? Because I think a lot of them are exploiting the perception rather than making their legislative decisions on reality. So what's your take on that?
So first, the revenue conference, mid-January, had a very similar presentation. There's a University of Michigan economist who directs their consumer, their survey of consumer sentiment and confidence, and pointed out the same very similar trends and variability of perceptions across demographic factors, and again, as was noted here, a strong one across political factors. There were not many lawmakers, there weren't many lawmakers in attendance at that, and there was not session going on that day, as I recall. So I think your question, do lawmakers understand this? My gut would tell me they're also sort of the same. I think you would get, if you surveyed the lawmakers themselves, it probably wouldn't look a lot different than this. And that wouldn't be totally critical either, because again, I do think, as Mark pointed out, if inflation is 5% and your income's growing 6%, costs are still going up a lot, but you may not be as concerned about it because I'm keeping up, as opposed to when inflation's 5% and you're 2%. And even if inflation's 2%, which is modest, but your income isn't growing, then you may still be concerned about the 2% because you're not keeping up. And I think if you looked across the street, you would see deviations in that probably come out in some of their data. And that probably, I think the average lawmaker probably looks at their constituency, wherever it is, and probably thinks similarly to their constituency.
Things I've learned over the course of time: number one is lawmakers reflect their constituents, and number two, perception is reality. So again, to the woman's comment in the back, even, we have a stark reality there among some of our seniors who are retired or retiring and unable to afford basic necessities. That's happening. So you have to juxtapose each against each other. So I think Mark had.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the survey was taken in September and October of last year. I mean, one of the obvious questions to me is, I mean, you can't help but notice the Republican-Democrat difference in perception. You survey people right in the middle of a general election, of a pretty tumultuous general election campaign. I mean, to what extent do you think that altered your numbers?
We'll find out next year. But yeah, I think it was very, a very tumultuous time, and so we're all a little heated. And
Sure.
So I'm certain that had some influence.
I just comment quick and to supplement what Mark just shared. The U of M presentation at the CREC did look at it. It had a longer sampling period, and it showed those partisan gaps have been fairly consistent.
I'd always expect a partisan gap, but I just wondered if you thought it was broader because of the timing.
I was wondering if, when you put this together, it was really interesting to see the perceptions, but did you have, but not include, or is this something that just doesn't exist, the actual, I know CPI is national, but is there anything that exists in Michigan showing, okay, here's the perception of gasoline, groceries, household, but here is, basically, the best that any person putting data together can do. Here's the actual of what happened over the last 5 years. Does that exist? Does that data exist? That's what I would love to see side by side.
You mean like, does there exist in like a public?
A Michigan CPI.
Yeah, they used
for the
Dearborn.
issues.
They did
Yeah.
use the
Before Dearborn and Warren CPI exists.
Okay.
That's what BLS is trying to figure out, because there's only 3 metropolitan cities included in those CPI, and it doesn't really capture all the regions that I showed in the map before. There are a lot of rural places in Michigan, and they don't capture all of them, so unfortunately we don't have it yet, but we're working on that.
And is your PowerPoint open to the public?
Yes,
is it
we'll be
downloadable?
posting it.
Okay.
Yeah, all the material that you saw here today will be posted on our website. Yeah, young man right there.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I'm curious if you know, or if in the perception category you also looked at different income levels and what their perception of it is, because my hunch is that maybe, the average, on average it might be keeping up, but maybe some the lower income bracket, whatever level it happens to be, the low 25%, low 50%, et cetera, are being left behind at all by that?
Well, there has been like 10 brackets in the survey, from like lower than 10K, 10K to 20K. So we had some limitations on aggregating that. So I aggregated in 4 group category, which is based on 2024 Michigan median income. So that will be like a quartile level that you see.
So you can see that it's the middle income groups that perceive the higher prices more so than the upper income and the lowest income. But that low income is pretty low. 30K.
Below 30K.
Okay. Well, if there are no other questions or comments, let's have another round of applause for our... And for legislative staff that are in the room, you'll be getting notice in the next week or so probably. We're going to be doing a legislative staff training on February the 24th via Zoom. And then our next public policy forum, I believe, is March 25th. And we have already commitments from Treasurer Eubanks and Budget Director Flood to be with us then. So join us for that discussion.